Hello, this is Clarence Moye with Awards Daily, here with David Hyde Pierce, co-star of HBO's Julia, and I should say Emmy-winning David Hyde Pierce. How are you?
I'm good, Clarence. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good.
I am. It is such an incredible honor for me to speak with you. I'm a huge fan of yours since Frasier. In fact, I was just thinking about what are my one of my favorite Frasier moments had to have been. I believe it was a Christmas episode where Frasier was dating someone who he was maybe she was Jewish or something like that, and you were hiding in the bathroom and you were dressed as Jesus, and then all of a sudden you pop out at this opportune moment, and it's brilliant, brilliant physical comedy.
It was. It's one of my favorite episodes, also, and it's one of the great things about it. It was well on into the Frasier series, so we've had a lot of these kind of farces, and this was a complete farce. You're right. Frasier was dating a girl who was Jewish, and her mom was unexpectedly coming to visit, and
Right.
so um, she asked that Frasier pretend that he was Jewish, and uh, and then there were all these. I remember. Jake Hogan, our writer who wrote it, he consulted his rabbi after he wrote the script. He said, "Is this okay?" And he said, "Oh, absolutely, it's hysterical." But one of my favorite things about it was the sophistication of the writers. That after all these years of setting up these elaborate farces, there's a moment where Niles is in the kitchen and Dad comes in, and Niles says, "We all have to pretend that we're Jewish," and Dad just says, "Okay." And it's like, no, he's been through it so many times, he didn't even need more explanation. So,
Exactly.
yeah. Anyway.
Brilliant, brilliant cast. So moving on to your brilliant work in HBO Max's Julia, I know that you had been involved with this for several years, but because of COVID and some other things, you moved in and out of it, but you came back to it. What was it about the role of Paul Child that most appealed to you initially?
It's a really good part. I mean, that's what it boils down to. It's because he was such a complicated, interesting man, and because they captured him, and the writers captured this kind of wonderful relationship that he had with Julia. Um, all of that was just really appealing, and we don't get to see that much of this kind of relationship, this kind of intense relationship between two strong personalities, two
Mhm.
very sort of sensual beings in every sense of the word, at this point in their lives.
Right.
He's in his 60s, she's in her 50s. So that was a nice change, too.
Absolutely. So I know that you did a great deal of research on Paul. I know there's a lot of material that's available thanks to their how open they were with their lives and sharing their letters to the Schlesinger Library
Yeah.
there in Cambridge. But what are some of the key pieces of information that best help you figure out who Paul Child was?
Um, One of the most important things, he lost his dad. He and his twin brother, Charlie, lost their dad when they were 6 months old. So he never knew his dad. Um, in that sense, the only dad he had would have been his father-in-law, Julia's dad, who was a very strong personality, very conservative. Paul was really liberal and really didn't like or approve of Paul. So there's this complicated uh, relationship with that father. There's this woman that Paul met, Edith Kennedy, when he was in his 20s. And she was to him what he later became to Julia. She introduced him to a world he'd never seen before, Europe and France and jazz and culture and music and sophistication and all that stuff. And so that was pivotal. And I think there's something really interesting about the idea that he fell so deeply and profoundly in love with this woman who changed his life. And then she died at a young age and he lost her. Uh, and he thought he would never find love again, certainly not with that kind of person. And then he found Julia, which is miraculous. And I think that may be a key to the depth of his affection for her and his devotion to her.
One of the obviously the relationship between those two characters is sort of the backbone of the show. It is the crux on which most of the more poignant moments are placed. One thing that we do know about Paul that isn't quite covered as dramatically in this show as it has been elsewhere is his experience with being in the government in the late 50s and early 60s, the
Mm-hmm.
tumultuous experience of it, and eventually retiring in 1961. I would imagine you as an actor keep a lot of that as subtext to some of the scenes that move forward. Did that prove to be the case?
It's totally the case, and it drives me out of my mind because there's a whole backstory there that I think we're going to maybe finally hear a bit more about in season two. But the Paul was in the diplomatic corps for many years, and he and Julia met in World War II, working in Ceylon and in China, uh, and there is a point where he was brought into Washington during the sort of McCarthy era and interrogated. And there are hints dropped about that throughout the first season. He variously he says, "Well, I was forced retirement," and at one point he lets drop to talking to Bibi, to Avis Devoto. He says, "Well, when I was fired," and she says, "You were fired?" And he says, "Well, no, not exactly." So the writers have been very cryptic. They obviously know what happened, but it's not something that Paul speaks readily of, and so sometimes, people who've watched the show come up to me and say, "Oh, so Paul was fired," and I'm like, I can't talk. It's so I'm looking forward to the truth coming out. However, the writers choose to reveal that.
Excellent. In France, I hear, for season two. So I hear you got to get your
Sadly,
passport ready.
sadly, yes, we will be
Yes.
filming in France for the first, I think, 3 episodes, but we're
Uh,
all just bucking up and going to go.
yeah. Well, try to persevere, because poor Fran, he has to stay back in Boston. He told me.
Yeah, there are a few of us who get stuck back in Boston. You're right.
Yeah.
But c'est
So
la vie.
say Levy. So talking about that ensemble, this is one of the great strengths of Julia, is this fantastic ensemble, and you, of course, are no stranger to strong ensembles yourself. One of the things, when I was talking to Dan and Chris, the creators and showrunners, one of the things that they surprised me with was that because of COVID, the team wasn't allowed to do rehearsals. You're coming from a theater background. Ensembles live on rehearsals, bonding time, and building that relationship and how to interact with each other. But you didn't have that here. You barely even got to sit down and have a meal together, which I find criminal considering it's a show about Julia Child.
Right.
How, outside of just being tremendous actors, which you all are, how did you sort of overcome that gap in terms of that rehearsal, or that bonding time that I think is so visible on screen?
Um, well, first things first, what you were seeing is absolutely there. It's a very close company. And in my experience, that happens when the actors are good. It doesn't always happen when the actors are good, but if people can't do their job, the bonding doesn't happen, because we're there for one reason, and that's to play these roles. This is a group of theater, as you rightly pointed out. These are theater actors, basically every one of them, I think. And so that's part one of, I think, why we were able to bond so quickly, in spite of the lack of rehearsal. And they're all people who've worked on camera before, so we're familiar with the idea that you might not get as much rehearsal as in the theater. But the other thing is, I think perversely, COVID helped. I think the complete dependence on each other, not only for the getting the work done, but for staying healthy, to stay working, dependent on each other as a cast, as a crew, dependent on the COVID people, dependent on HBO Max and how they ran that whole COVID monitoring system. All of those things, as difficult and frustrating as it sometimes was, I think unconsciously also it was that intense bond that, in a way, the whole country felt, or at least I can say, being in New York City, we felt that even though we weren't able to actually be with each other and do what we normally do every day in New York, we were together because that thing was bonding us.
Right. I know you've talked a lot about your history with Bibi Newirth, who is, plays Avis on the show. You obviously work together on Frasier. You come from the same theater community in New York. I know it must have been challenging to kind of, there's an animosity between Avis, or playful animosity, that between Avis and Paul in the early section of the show. And then, of course, during the flu episode, they bond a bit. It must have been difficult to mask that personal love for Bibi in those first couple of episodes, though.
No, I mean, think about it. First of all, the relationship that we had on Frasier
True. And, yeah.
was also quite a cool one, and except for the episode where we ended up sleeping together, that got kind of hot. But no, it's like playing tennis or fencing with a great partner. Yes, it's a combat. It's or can be a combative thing, but when you're doing it with a pal, um, it's really fun because you trust each other.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my favorite episodes is Breads, where you and Judith, played by Fiona Glascott, essentially help Julia out with testing a bread recipe, and they can't get it right. I mean, there's, I don't know how many breads were gone through in that episode, but it's quite a few. Talk to me about filming that and sort of what that means, what that provides to the overall narrative.
Well, it was a great. The writers are very good at mixing and matching us up.
Mhm.
You know, that as you said, there's for me and for Sarah, the core relationship is our marriage, but there are all of these other connections that get explored, and I'm sure will continue to get explored in season two. And that was putting me together with Fiona, first of all, because I adore her. And boy, one of the great pleasures of getting to actually see the show on the air is seeing the scenes that I wasn't in.
Right.
And there's a whole lot of from all the company, but I'm just thinking of her now, so her stuff with Judith Light and stuff, just amazing, beautifully played scenes. So it was fun to get to do that. It was fun to get, and here's an example of the opposite of what you were talking about with BB, which is we're two people who like each other very much and respect each other very much, but we don't know each other that well. We really met on this show, and we did have to play an arc of two people working together where she wasn't necessarily so happy to be stuck with Paul making bread, and then over the arc of the episode, we come to be a team. It was a blast, and I just adore her. So that was fun.
It's a hugely funny and very entertaining and engaging sequence. So I was very happy to see those two characters have that time together, because they're, you know, you're right, the show does pair off characters in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
um, so you obviously have great strengths as an actor in the dramatic world as well as the comic world. Where are you most comfortable?
Smack in the middle.
Smack in the middle, which
Yeah,
is
I
perfect
think
for
that
this show because this show balances comedy and drama quite nicely.
it does, and you know, Frasier did too. Frasier was much more clearly a comedy. It was a situation comedy, but I think what grounded it, both from the acting standpoint and the writing standpoint, was that it also had a reality to it. It wasn't just funny. And same thing with this. This is, um, you know, I know with awards you have to pick a category and you have to say, well, it's this kind of show and it's that kind of show. And I think one of the great strengths of this show is that it isn't one or the other. It's a whole lot of things.
Mhm. Absolutely. In the last episode of the season, you have this moment, this beautiful moment with Julia, where you say, "Let's say yes to everything." You know, we're at this age in our lives. We, you know, let's not live a life that is unfulfilled. Let's do the show. Let's go to France. Let's do another cookbook. It's all out there. Let's just say yes to everything. Um, Earlier in the series, though, Paul was not necessarily in the mode to say yes to everything. In fact, he was very adamantly against the TV show.
Mm-hmm.
But there's that narrative arc, that journey that he goes on. What do you think is the most key contribution to him changing that perspective on her career?
I actually think it happens in the very first episode,
Okay.
where as the writers have crafted this version of their story, Paul is very against television. He thinks it's a fad and beneath Julia, and also he's afraid it's going to take her away from working on the second volume of Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and he thinks that's the most important thing. And there's a scene where she and Julia are sort of trying to convince him / trick him into going along with it. And they're trying to appeal to all the things that he believes in. And there's a moment where he looks at Julia, and she's pretending to be hesitant about wanting to do this. And he says, "But you're a star."
Yeah.
And those words have never come out of his mouth before about her. He loves her, he worships her, he thinks she can do anything. But in that moment, he understands why she must do this and why it doesn't matter what the medium is, that this is a chance for the world to see her as he sees her. Um, and in a later episode, he says to her dad, I wish you could see her the
Right.
way I see her. So I think that is the key.
That's a poignant moment you're talking about with where you're playing against James Cromwell, who plays her father.
Yeah.
We should could see her as I see her. That is it's very touching. It's
Mhm.
this show is so deeply emotional. It's joyous, but it's also deeply it hits home in a lot of deeply emotional ways. Um, Last question for you. So you're obviously one of the great things I love about Paul is the things that we've learned through the series, just in the normal course of the series. Things like he was instrumental in building the set for the French chef. He had a lot of great ideas. The fact that she walks off camera, goes to the little dining room next in the next room, Paul's idea because he thought she should, share the eating of the food and the serving of the food with her viewers. What are some other things? I don't know if you've read the scripts yet, no spoilers, but what are some other things you would like to explore outside of his background within the government work that you've already mentioned that you would like to
Mhm.
explore in season two?
Uh, well, I think it's going to be really interesting. And I haven't seen a script, so I can't ruin anything for you.
Okay.
Since we're going to France and we're going to be with Simca, who
Super.
played by Isabella Rossellini, I'm fascinated to see what the nature of Paul and Simca's relationship is. We've got a hint of it. He seems a little bit prickly about her, and certainly she and Julia, though they collaborate, are a little bit oil and water. So I think there's some fun there to be had there. And what else? I think uh, what I'm happy about in the first season is that Paul was able to come in. The strength of Paul and Julia's relationship was able to manifest itself by the end of the season because, for dramatic reasons, there was a lot of focus on problems in the relationship or him not being as supportive of her. And now that they are solidly a team, I will be very excited to see how that plays out in the various venues that we'll be in, and as her career and the show continues to grow.
Absolutely. I'm very excited about season two. And I wish you were already filming it so it would be on HBO Max even sooner.
I
But
know, me too.
say love you.
Yeah.
Well, David Hyde Pierce, thank you so much for the time today. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise, Clarence. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Yep.